In this video, I'm going to be asking some hypothetical questions about the swine flu pandemic of 2009, a pandemic we were warned by Margaret Chan, Director General of the World Health Organization at the time, promised to be the greatest pandemic ever. I'm going to be exploring what might have happened if we'd dealt with it by totally abandoning all our long-established, well-thought-out pre-pandemic plans and decided instead to go with national lockdowns. Let's start with this 2-minute Channel 4 news report from 2010, just to remind ourselves what happened.
Greatest medical scandals of the century, according to a leading health expert in Brussels. The Council of Europe health chief has accused major pharmaceutical firms of organizing a campaign of panic and unduly influencing World Health Organization decisions. And with European countries now burdened with bills for millions of unwanted doses of the swine flu vaccine, he wants an investigation. Our science correspondent Tom Clark has this report.
The predictions for the impact of swine flu on Britain were grim. The government's response, spending hundreds of millions of pounds on antiviral drugs and vaccines, adverts and leaflets. Were governments misled into preparing for the worst? Politicians in Brussels are now asking for an investigation into the role pharmaceutical companies played in influencing political decisions that led to a swine flu spending spree.
There must be a process to get more transparency, how the decisions in the WHO, how they function, and who is influencing the decisions of the WHO, and what is the role of the pharmaceutical industry there. I'm very suspicious about the processes which are behind this pandemic.
The Council of Europe Committee want the investigation to focus on the World Health Organization's decision to lower the threshold required for a pandemic to be formally declared.
The world is now at the start of the 2009 influenza pandemic.
When this happened in June last year, governments had to activate huge pre-prepared contracts for drugs and vaccines with manufacturers. They also want to probe ties between key WHO advisors and drug companies.
Who is deciding what the risk is? Is it the pharmaceutical companies who want to sell drugs, or is it someone making a decision based on the perceived danger? In this case, it appears that the danger was vastly exaggerated. And was it exaggerated by the pharmaceutical companies in order to make money?
Citing commercial confidentiality, the Department of Health won't actually tell us how much swine flu vaccine they actually ordered. But it's thought contracts were signed for 90 million doses. Yet fewer than 4 million people in the UK have actually had the jab. Officials here are now in negotiation with their key supplier, GlaxoSmithKline, to see if they can't rewrite that very expensive contract.
Now, the independent fact-checkers are big fans of the BBC's Trusted News Initiative, so here is a link to a BBC report at the time of a similar story. Please read the article for yourself, but I'm struck by some snippets, which I will draw your attention towards. Some medical experts doubt whether this was really a pandemic at all. So even before swine flu emerged, the WHO supported member states in drawing up pandemic plans, including buying antiviral drugs, preparing mass vaccination campaigns, and developing procedures for banning public gatherings and closing schools. By the time swine flu broke out, many countries had already introduced the plans, and some industrialized nations had even signed pre-contracts with the pharmaceutical companies to buy vaccines. A key question will be whether the pharmaceutical companies, which had invested around $4 billion in developing the swine flu vaccine, had supporters inside the emergency committee, who then put pressure on the WHO to declare a pandemic. The WHO has struggled to offer clear answers on the question of its definition of a pandemic, partly because of its policy of keeping the identity and the deliberations of its Pandemic Emergency Advisory Committee secret. Okay, so you get the idea of what happened with swine flu. You may have forgotten, or like me, you never really knew or cared. The Labour MP Paul Flynn, who features in both this article and the Channel 4 news report, passed away in February 2019. However, Wolfgang Wodarg, who features in the Channel 4 news report, is alive and well, so you may be keen to find out what his opinions are on any other topics you may be interested in at the moment. You may need to dig a little below the surface, as much of what he has recently had to say has been censored or described as misleading information. So what would have happened if we'd gone down the road of national lockdowns and masks to deal with swine flu? Of course, we know they weren't needed because we didn't go down this road and everything was fine. But how would we have known if we'd done them at the time? I'm going to be asking you to imagine a few hypothetical situations. For example, let's imagine that some famous epidemiologists were predicting swine flu deaths on an unprecedented scale. As it happens, we don't have to imagine on this one, because that's exactly what Neil Ferguson, amongst other experts, was doing. In May 2009, The Guardian, who I believe are also a reputable source according to the fact-checkers, reported that he said that it's likely to spread around the world in the next 6 to 9 months, and when it does so, it will affect about 1/3 of the world's population. So if every country had employed a lockdown, what would have stopped these experts claiming that the differences between their model predictions and the final outcome was attributable to these lockdowns? We might have been told that the curve had turned over because of the measures that had been put in place. How would we have known if this was true? Of course, we're in a privileged position of knowing that it's not true, because we've lived through the time of swine flu, and we know that, like basically every respiratory virus in history, the swine flu death curve turned over quite happily by itself, without any intervention. But how would we have known it wasn't because of interventions, if that's what we were being told by the government's chosen experts? Especially when you consider that the director of the WHO was telling us that it was going to be the greatest pandemic ever. Surely we wouldn't have been stupid enough to get taken in by this. Okay, maybe a layperson like me might, not appreciating I had fallen prey to the cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. But there's no way all the other experts would have let this pass as unchallenged orthodoxy. The other thing that surely would have happened is that there would have been a public debate as to whether this brand new policy idea was justified. A debate where many different experts' opinions were allowed to be heard. At the very least, some kind of cost-benefit analysis would have been taken, even if the experts mistakenly assumed that the measures were going to be effective in preventing swine flu deaths. Now imagine a world where politicians and the mainstream media, for some reason, didn't facilitate an open debate about this brand new policy, and didn't even explain to the public that there needed to be a proper cost-benefit analysis based on quality-adjusted life years. Surely once the policy had been in operation for a few months, it would have become clear from every single correlational study performed that there was no link whatsoever between these never-tried-before policies suddenly being employed across the globe and the outcome in terms of swine flu deaths, say. Remember that we know for a fact that lockdowns were not needed for swine flu because we didn't use them and everything was fine. Surely then the mainstream media channels, operating with journalistic integrity and independently of each other, would have made the general public aware of these studies and would have made the public aware that at the very least there were many experts who disagreed with the policy. The only thing I can think of that would mean they all played the same tune and decided not to do this is if they received massive amounts of funding from organisations who stood to benefit from the eventual perceived need for swine flu vaccines. And we've seen from the Channel 4 news report and the BBC article that this just can't have been the case at the time. Okay, there may have been some experts who were being silenced or smeared, or perhaps even suffering conflicts of interest. You're always going to get the odd rotten apple when you consider the amount of money that stood to be made from the swine flu vaccines. But surely there would have been enough experts speaking out, and the honest politicians would have desisted with the unnecessary policy. Surely we wouldn't have been given the false impression that a general consensus had been reached in the scientific community when it had not. In any case, you'd think there would have been a control group, because not every single country, independently run as they all are, would just copy the same policy, especially a completely untested policy with very predictable catastrophic costs. Even if most countries in the world employed a swine flu lockdown, the odd one or two would have stuck with their pre-existing pandemic plans. Just picking a country at random, let's say that, I don't know, Sweden decided not to do a swine flu lockdown. And let's imagine that a bar chart showing their deaths over a decade ended up looking like this, with slightly higher deaths in the swine flu year, 2009. In fact, 2009 was not the highest number of annual deaths recorded in Sweden over this decade. But let's just imagine that it was. Even with slightly more deaths in 2009, it surely would have then been clear that Sweden, the country not employing this never-tried-before policy, was broadly speaking fine, and surely then the government, their experts and the media would have been forced to admit that lockdowns were a catastrophic blunder with regards to swine flu. Just because the country's mortality experts can get caught up in complex models and maths, it's not going to stop them using their own two eyes, and admitting a simple bar chart like this shows that nothing particularly special is going on. They surely wouldn't have resorted to obfuscation tactics and debated the nuances of the fourth or fifth most important rating factor when it comes to pandemic mortality, like population density or geographical location, say. They would simply remember that we had been told that if we didn't do a swine flu lockdown, hundreds of thousands of people were going to die, yet here was a country showing us very clearly that this was untrue. They would remember that we'd been told it was going to be the greatest pandemic ever. Mind you, it might have been hard for them to break through their own cognitive dissonance. Remember, we have the privilege of knowing for a fact that lockdowns were not needed for swine flu because we didn't do them and everything was fine. In the hypothetical world where lockdowns were used to fight swine flu, I suppose some experts may have lost the ability to look at a bar chart, or they may have simply self-censored under the pressure of groupthink. Now, continuing this hypothetical situation, let's think about what else might have made it more difficult to spot that these brand new policies were a catastrophic blunder in the fight against swine flu. Imagine there'd been a medical test brought in, I don't know, let's say the blow-up swine test, or BS test for short, which detected minuscule traces of the swine flu virus and amplified them to the extent that it classified all sorts of different people as having the swine flu virus, including those whose bodies were quite happily fighting the virus off. And imagine that for some reason, and in spite of the inventor of the test pointing out that it was not meant to be used as a diagnostic test, governments decided to use this test to exaggerate the numbers, so that anyone who died within 28 days of a positive BS test, for whatever reason, was included in the swine flu death statistics. It's possible we could have been made to mistakenly believe that many of the people who were going to die in 2009 anyway had died because of swine flu. Let's also imagine that the government psychology unit had decided it was expedient, and very ethical too, to get the media to scare the living hell out of its people by displaying these grossly exaggerated statistics on the news and on the internet every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, accompanied by warnings and adverts everywhere you go of horrific images of patients dying in hospital with swine flu. Okay, the odd bit of propaganda could have made things more difficult for the experts, but surely this kind of deliberate deception wouldn't have been tolerated. And besides, the experts would have realized that the BS test data was essentially meaningless, and they would have reverted to studying excess all-cause mortality, remembering, of course, that the Sweden example was always lurking in the background, on top of the massive pile of correlational studies confirming what, of course, we know as a fact, which is that no lockdown was ever necessary for swine flu. So I have no doubt that had some kind of global fraud like this unfolded, it would have been hastily stopped in its tracks. However, science journalist Jane Burgermeister argues that we came much closer to this hypothetical situation than any of us ever realised. I can't speak for anyone else, but I navigated my way through 2009 and 2010, barely noticing or caring one iota about swine flu. It's actually only recently I've become interested in it for some reason. In this video, recorded in 2012, Jane Burgermeister gives her warning to the world. It's 15 minutes long, so I won't repeat it here, but I will include the link in the video description. I'm just wondering, should the world have listened a bit more carefully to her warning? She talks about some of the victims of the swine flu vaccines, and she asks what might have been if entire populations had been forced to take them, given the horrific side effects experienced by some of the small percentage of the populations that did take them. She warns of corruption within the WHO and other powerful global organisations. She warns of the clear conflict of interest in the privatisation of the early warning system for global pandemics. She points out how lucky it is that the swine flu vaccines, along with their dangerous side effects, were not, in the end, rolled out to entire populations. In the end, surely we didn't come as close as Jane Burgermeister thinks. Even if the corrupt powers of which she speaks had coordinated with governments to get us all obeying new orders for, I don't know, 2 years say, locked in our homes, fearful and wearing masks, destroyed our businesses, caused devastation in terms of increased cancers and other undetected diseases, traumatized children and interfered in their education, started a tidal wave of mental health problems, and then caused untold damage with the swine flu vaccines that the entire fraud was designed to peddle, there surely would have come a time when the people woke up and realised what had been done to them. In the UK, for example, even something as simple as a Freedom of Information request to the ONS, showing that in fact, as it turned out, only about 12%, say, of all those deaths recorded using the BS test were patients dying solely of swine flu, surely would have finally blown the lid off the whole scam. I guess we'll never know, because it's hypothetical. Again, we have the privilege of knowing that all of these measures would have been a catastrophic blunder with respect to swine flu, because we know as a fact that we didn't employ them and everything was fine. Who knows? Maybe it might have been difficult for people at the time to break free of the cognitive dissonance, if they were living through it, especially if they've been subjected to a global propaganda campaign of fear, and they were heavily emotionally invested in their view of the great swine flu pandemic. Personally, I feel grateful that this hypothetical tyranny was not thrust upon us back in 2009, because it meant that I was able to enjoy my freedom for another decade before the real pandemic came along. As I say this, I'm reminded of a quote from the French philosopher Voltaire. If there were no God, it would be necessary to invent him.